Welcome to today's CEDA live stream event on the Sustainable Development Goals, a blueprint for better outcomes. I'm Melinda Salento, the CEO of CEDA, and it's my pleasure to join with you today in this really important conversation. I'm going to be facilitating the conversation throughout our hour together, and it should be a really good one. Can I start by acknowledging of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. In thinking about sustainability, I thought it was worth just acknowledging that earlier this year during the devastating bushfires, it was really interesting to observe the role that Indigenous knowledge can play in the issue of sustainability, in the area of sustainability, and in this instance, in thinking about prevention of bushfires. So as we acknowledge traditional owners, I think it's also important to acknowledge their contribution in so many ways and where we can use their contribution even more. Can I also thank and acknowledge our sponsors for today's event, Monash University. We've got a stellar lineup of speakers today. Let me introduce them for you. We have Professor John Thwaites, who is the chair of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, ClimateWorks and BehaviourWorks Australia. We have Professor Rod Glover, who is Professor of Policy and Impact at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. We have Sam Mostyn, who's the chair and non-executive director he's the chair and non-executive director of Sustainability Advisor, Mirvac, Transurban, Virgin Australia, and the Centre for Policy Development and City Australia. Sam, it's always a nightmare reading out your CV. And also recently appointed as President of Chief Executive Women. So congratulations on that appointment, Sam. And then we have Nicole Bradford, who's the Portfolio Head of Responsible Investment with Cbus. As always, we'd love for our viewers to participate in the conversation that we're having right now. You can do so by joining the Pigeonhole app that we use. You can post questions there and you can respond to questions that we're going to put to you. There is already a poll question there around where you would like to see progress in areas of the Sustainable Development Goals. If you haven't already opened it, you can do so ceda.pigeonhole.at. And the password today is SDG 2020. So please jump on there, get ready to ask questions. And also we love it when you promote the ideas and insights that you're hearing through social media. If you do so, please tag us at CEDA_news if you're on Twitter, hashtag SDG. That's probably enough from me. I'd love to kick off the conversation. Starting today, we're going to hear from Professor John Thwaites, who's going to run us through the latest update, if you like, on where Australia is against the SDGs, and then we'll move to the panel discussion. So over to you. Thanks, John.
Well, thank you very much, Melinda. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting virtually. I think all of us now are very focused on, excuse me, very focused on how we're going to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. There is a widespread desire to build back better, and certainly our recovery from COVID needs to address challenges that existed before the pandemic, not make them worse. If we're going to build back better, though, we're going to have to do some things differently and not continue to make mistakes of the past. And I think there is some evidence that people are prepared to embrace change now. A recent Essential poll showed that 78% of Australians believed that there was an opportunity to explore new ways to run the economy. And I think the other bit of good news is that trust in government in Australia has risen significantly since COVID. A recent YouGov poll indicated 73% of Australians had trust in government. And that's increased significantly since COVID, and I think clearly is linked to the fact that we've performed pretty well in tackling COVID. And we've done that because governments have pretty much followed the science and the evidence. And I think as a result of that, people can be pretty proud of what we've achieved, and there's a sense of community efficacy, which is a really good basis to tackle some of the ongoing challenges that we highlighted in our report, challenges like climate change, growing inequality, youth unemployment, and biodiversity decline. If we are going to build back better, we do need to understand where we were before COVID. What were our strengths and weaknesses, where we want to get to as a country, and what are the impacts of COVID on all of that. And this is exactly what our report does, using the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework. And it is worth highlighting that the Sustainable Development Goals are a very good framework for planning the recovery. First, they address the key challenges: health, jobs, innovation, inequality, climate change. They were developed with input from literally millions of people around the world, and importantly from business. Business were involved from the start in the development and definition of the goals. And now the SDGs are the globally agreed framework for sustainable development from now until 2030. They are a benchmark that is going to be used to judge governments and businesses and our progress in achieving those 2030 targets. And I think that's why we're seeing more and more companies and investors using the goals. But they're also a really useful framework for planning, because they do help us to look wider and to look longer, to focus on 2030, which I think is the right time frame if we're going to build back better. So our report, Transforming Australia, the SDG Progress Report 2020 update, is a report card on Australia's progress in achieving the SDGs leading into the COVID crisis. But it also highlights the potential impact of COVID-19 on our ability to meet the targets by 2030. This report, Transforming Australia 2018 report, which was carried out with the National Sustainable Development Council. And I'm very pleased that we've got Sam Mostyn from the council and Rod Glover from the council on the panel today. And also the Monash Sustainable Development Institute Director, Tony Capon, who was on that National Council as well. But since we reported in 2018, there have been some changes, and the biggest change of all is COVID. And that's why we believed it was appropriate to update the report to take account of that. And the report has been prepared by Monash Sustainable Development Institute, led by Dr. Cameron Allen, Professor Glover, Julie Bolton, and Dr. Tal Keston. And it's linked also to Monash's commitment to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And Monash is also undertaking a major project, the Monash Melbourne experiment, led by our provost, to understand the impact of COVID on Victoria. And this report links to that. The report makes three important contributions. First, it proposes an initial set of quantitative 2030 targets for Australia across 56 economic, social, and environmental indicators. Second, it assesses our progress towards these targets, looking back to 2000, highlighting where we're on track to achieve the 2030 target and where we're off track. And third, it evaluates the effects of COVID on our capacity to achieve the goals. And just before I go to the details of the report, briefly, I'd like to focus on the importance of targets for Australia, because they are vital if we're going to have a vision of where we want to get to and to drive action to build back better. The official SDG framework includes quantitative targets for about a third of the targets. But the intent of the whole agenda is that countries should adopt their own national target values. And many countries, and indeed businesses, have done that. The Senate inquiry into the SDGs in 2018 highlighted that Australia lacks targets for many important areas. And so for our assessment, we've proposed a set of targets which draw upon the official SDGs, but also on Australian government targets and global benchmarks like the OECD top 5 performers. And we're proposing this as an initial set to start a conversation about targets for 2030. So what are our findings? And I'd like to give you a brief overview, and if we could put the slides up now, that would be great. And I do urge all of you to go on that website, SDG Transforming Australia, and you'll be able to see our full report and the dashboard and the infographics. And also, I'd recommend, if you're interested, I think there's an article in The Conversation today and further media. Well, what are our findings? First, if I can get the next slide. The next slide up. What we see in Australia is an economic success story at the headline level, where we've had 28 years of economic growth, and national disposable income in Australia has increased very substantially since 2000, although the gains have been fairly marginal since around 2011, 2012. However, in the immediate term, COVID has had a negative impact on this indicator, with an 8% reduction in the June 2020 quarter. But despite that strong success, we have got some fundamental structural challenges. And if I could get the next slide. Melinda, are we able to get the team to put the next slide up?
It's there, John. I think it's...
Okay, well, I'm not seeing it. Okay, well, the next slide is... No, it should be the one before that. Before that? Yes, that's right, poverty, thank you. So I think the first structural challenge is that despite all of that growth in income, our poverty levels have not substantially reduced. And the official SDG target is to halve poverty by 2030. We're not doing that. We're bouncing along pretty much where we've been for the last 15 years. And the big issue for poverty is in job seeker New Start payments. Back in 2000, New Start represented close to the poverty line. Last year, it was 30% below the poverty line. And with New Start or job seeker supplements finishing in March, we're likely to see thousands of more people below the poverty line. Next slide. The next structural challenge is really, are we investing for the future? And some indicators would indicate that we're not. Expenditure on research and development as a share of GDP has declined in recent years and is well below the average of OECD countries of 2.4%. Next slide. And despite our growth, it appears that wealth hasn't been shared equally, and the wealth gains from our economic growth have been concentrated on the top. And our report shows that the share of household net worth of the bottom 40% of households has declined by 30% since 2004. And once again, it's well below the average of the top 5 OECD countries and heading in the wrong direction. Next slide. And what about the impact on people on unemployment and underemployment? What you see there the black line is unemployment, which has come down slightly from around 6% to 5% over the last 20 years. But that's been matched by a big increase in underemployment, people not working the hours that they want. And you'll see that both unemployment and underemployment have suffered a massive kick up under COVID, particularly affecting women, young people, and those with lower qualifications. Next slide. And even before COVID hit, Australia had a problem with young people not in education, employment or training, nearly 12%, compared to the target that we set, which is based on the top 5 in the OECD, of 5.9%. And COVID-19 has certainly had a negative impact on this indicator, with labour force data showing a 37% increase in youth unemployment or not in education between July 2019 and July 2020. Now, as I indicated before, women also have been disproportionately affected by job losses as a result of COVID, and this compounds other issues faced by women through the pandemic. Next slide, please. This slide is based on a study by the Australian Institute of Criminology this year, which found that 8.2% of women in cohabiting relationships suffered physical violence from their partner in the 3 months to May. And research by Professor Jackie True and Dr. Naomi Fitzner at Monash this year with family violence practitioners has demonstrated an increase in the frequency, severity and complexity of violence against women in the Melbourne lockdown. Obviously a huge social challenge that we face. Next slide, please. Now, on most indicators, Australia performs very well in response. Life expectancy is among the longest in the world at 82.8 years, and that's the upper line there. But the red line below is Indigenous life expectancy, currently 73.6 years, which is still significantly below that of the non-Indigenous population, and another big challenge for us. Next slide. And we have some other big health challenges, and one of the biggest is obesity. You'll see there on that slide that the prevalence of obesity in Australia has increased substantially since 2008, and it's now 31.3% of the population, well off track of where the WHO would say we need to be. And there are other social issues that we highlight in the report. For example, the next slide, prison population, where there's been a massive increase in the prison population since 2006, despite crime not rising and homicides actually coming down. And of that prison population, a rising and shocking 27.5% of the population are Indigenous. Next slide. And the one area where Australia is performing worst by international standards is the environment and climate change. Australia's total greenhouse gas emissions, you'll see there on the slide, the black line from 2000 through to today, have declined only marginally, and little progress has been made since 2013. We are a long way off the target of emissions that we need in 2030 if we're going to be consistent with achieving global warming below 2 degrees. And on the next slide, you'll see one of the specific challenges, and that is renewable energy share in the total final energy consumption. Now, renewable energy is increasing its share significantly in electricity, where we're already well over 20%. But what this slide shows is the renewable energy share in the total energy in Australia, which includes transport and industry as well. And what you'll notice, the huge gap there between where we are, which is making only minor improvement, to where we need to be, with a very significant increase in renewables. And then the next slide, I think, is important as we're considering this global pandemic and understanding our role in an interconnected world with many developing countries in the region. And I think we have to note that Australia's overseas development is declining and is well below the target of 0.7% of gross national income. So finally, the last slide is the goals, the 17 goals, which are a framework for building back better. Australia's very effective response to COVID-19 has demonstrated the value of data and evidence for improving decisions. And we would say that this approach is also fundamental to successfully implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. That is, monitoring progress, using the best evidence to inform our policies and programs and investments. And that's our hope for the Transforming Australia report. Thank you, Melinda.
Well, thanks, John. And a slightly unenviable task for you in the sense that you had to present so much information in such a short period of time. And I think you really got some very important messages across. I think, you know, one of the things that really stood out for me when you looked at some of those graphs was just, you know, how long it takes to get things back on track. You know, the unemployment performance in Australia has been seen as something as quite stellar, if you like, but when you looked at your longer term chart, you could see how long it took to come down from the spike up to 6. And I think that's just really one example of, you know, how important it is to have these metrics and these goals sort of defining progress and driving progress in a way that wouldn't happen if you if they weren't there. Now, this is the time for the audience to shine. Please get your questions into Pigeonhole. If you haven't responded to the poll, please do so, because I will try to reference that throughout our conversation. While you're doing that, I'm going to go to the first question, which is actually a video question from Adam Fennessy, who is the Commissioner, Victorian Public Sector Commission. So,
my name is Adam Fennessy, and I'm the Victorian Government's Public Sector Commissioner. My question is, what does Sustainable Development Goals thinking imply for how governments need to think and work differently, especially in a post-COVID world?
Rod, I might get you to reflect on that one, if that's all right.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Melinda, and g'day, everyone. I think that one of the first observations I would like to make is just the performance of government during COVID. So what we've seen is government actually being really pragmatic, adapting very quickly to what are pretty extraordinary circumstances. We've seen some institutions and mechanisms that have really stood tall. We've seen a lot more attention on where things have gone wrong, but that doesn't really paint a very balanced picture, I don't think. And I would like to just shout out to just make a reference to the amazing sort of effort and perseverance of our public servants in the public interest, particularly in Victoria over the last 6 months or so. So what we've seen is government's been asked to do during COVID things that it really wasn't that well practiced in, collaborating, talking to people they don't usually talk to, drawing on evidence data effectively, explaining it to the community. You know, the daily press conferences of Premier and Chief Health Officer are quite an amazing act of stamina and clear messaging communications in a crisis. But also things like adapting with community sentiment and behaviours and adapting policy settings on a daily basis and learning more rapidly than the public sector normally would. And I think one of the real challenges for governments post-COVID is going to be, how do these things become a new normal for the public sector? Because the wickedness of the challenge that we've just gone through is just the beginning compared to what we face going forward when we think of the transition out of hopefully a health crisis, managing the reopening and the recovery in our economy, and beginning to sort of reimagine the future we want at the same time. All of that adds up to an incredible incredibly demanding task of governments and leaders. So SDG thinking is really powerful, as John mentioned, in encouraging people to think wider and think longer. And that will require a different approach to business as usual for government. So we're going to have to be out with the silo-based approaches. We've seen the importance during COVID of the linkages and the connections between different areas of policy and the coordination that's needed between different levels of government. That has to become a norm. We're going to have to step away, I think, in terms of governments, step away from a bit of the insularity that sees governments try and solve problems themselves without really engaging professionals or with communities, experts or communities or businesses, and without always thinking through how it might work in practice and leaving the room to adapt. So I think we're going to see hopefully less set and forget in policy. And finally, I think for policymakers, the demand that we've heard from time to time for the public service and for governments to just focus on delivering the agenda of the day, I think we really need to challenge that. And COVID has reminded us of the importance of always anticipating, preparing for the future, scenario planning, recognising the uncertainty of what we face. So hopefully we don't make that mistake again. At its best, I think that SDG thinking and the situation we find ourselves might lead us to a more open-minded, more explorative, more imaginative government that really cares about the ends that people value. And ideally, take the opportunity of this sort of all-in-it-together moment to be more participatory, inclusive, and maybe deliberative in how we engage people, communities, and experts.
Thanks, Rod. I think I really like the sentiment of it, and I'm going to use it as a neat little segue into the next question, actually, because, you know, I think one of the things that we have seen through COVID and we see in moments of crisis is actually business and government working together, different levels of government working together in ways that we perhaps don't normally expect. And I always find it interesting that we do that in a crisis, but then, you know, at the most difficult of times, but then we seem to back away from it in the more sort of normal times, if I can put it that way. We've got a question from Dr. Michael De Percy, which is kind of picking up on one of John's comments about the role of business, going back to the MDGs and sort of highlighting that the focus with those was very much about how business contributed and how it worked with the framework. And Sam, I guess this is a really obvious question for you, is, you know, what is the role of business? Is it, you know, the follow on from the MDGs to the SDGs? Is business as much a part of that SDG framework? And what should we be expecting from them?
Thanks, Melinda, and it's a really great question. And I want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining this great panel today from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And just go back to something that John said in his remarks, which was to remind us that business was part of the incredible stakeholder engagement that went on with the creation of the SDGs, and business hadn't been part of the MDGs. The MDGs was really a United Nations plan from 2000 to 2015 to almost act upon the developing economies to eradicate those big issues such as poverty and hunger. And many of those targets were met quite successfully if you look at the global engagement with the developing economies. What I think really makes the SDG so compelling for all of us, and as Rod said, for the collaborative efforts that can now take place between policymakers, politicians, governments of all sizes and shapes, and business and communities, and the not-for-profit sector and civil society, is that was the group of people that were together to draft those SDGs over the significant period up to 2015 when they were first gavelled by the United Nations. I was one of the lucky people to be in New York at the General Assembly when the SDGs were proclaimed, and the thing that struck me around the halls of the United Nations at that time was just the incredible presence of business leaders, really important global business leaders, and the alliances that were formed in the lead up to the SDGs, and then at that point when they were launched, to say there was an accountability with business. And as you've said, and as John said earlier, that the SDGs provided an extraordinary framework for thinking about the future. And you could actually pull down those elements of the SDGs that mattered most to individual businesses or businesses as a whole, or business communities and sectors, and really set those targets. And as we know, business loves a good target, and once you set that target, you really want to achieve it. And what we've seen through COVID is many reflecting on the fact that maybe COVID was somewhat of a dress rehearsal for a really good go at meeting the targets in the SDGs. I'm thinking of someone like Bain and Co, who wrote about this mid-year, when we were sort of in the heart of all of our really deep response to COVID. And they did call it a dress rehearsal for sustainability challenges, and made the point, which I think is important today, where John has taken us on those high-level aspirations and targets and how we're not meeting them, that we have 9 years left to hit 2030, and business understands targets in those timeframes. When we started working together as the National Sustainability Council, led by John, in 2013, 2030 seemed quite a way away, and seemed that we had a report back then which talked about conversations with the future, which included conversations with business. Today, it just seems to me that for businesses that have come through COVID and are thinking about being forces for good, contributing to a Build Back Better environment, we've got 9 years to 2030. That's a very short period of time to hit these targets. And all of the targets that John's taken us through for Australia, where we're lagging, seem to me to be at the heart of the aspiration that good business has to actually reset and get out there and make a solid contribution to Australia's economic and social and prosperity future. And only this morning I attended the AGM for Mirvac. And once again, I was really heartened to hear our Chief Executive, Sue Lloyd-Hurwitz, frame the coming years in the context of the big sustainability challenges and what it will mean for business to be a force for good. And she highlighted climate change and social inclusion, gender equality, better environmental outcomes, and good economic prospects and good jobs for those that have missed out as a focus for her as a leader of Mirvac. And she joins many business leaders who are using the SDGs to frame that. And of course, that requires business to be thought of as a partner with government in the way Rod has described, and civil society, and to do this enthusiastically, taking all that energy that we've got from COVID. So, I think this is one of the great moments for business to step up, as it did in the formation of the SDGs, and really throw everything at this and ask the question as to why this has been such a difficult challenge for our federal governments over the last few years to engage with what business is actually now incorporated into normal business planning and the aspiration for being a force for good. So, I think with a shortened time frame, there's a lot we'll do. We'll see business doing better, but I think we need to do this in a very strategic way with our federal, state and local governments, all doing that in a very collaborative fashion.
Thanks, Sam. And, I think this point about using this moment is a really good one. We've got this moment in time where I think we have pulled together. We can see the horizon. It's before us. We've had, I know you and I and many, I think pretty much all of the participants today will have been part of things like the 2020 summit, etc. And you look back and you think, wow, if only we'd been a little bit more courageous in some of the things that we tackled, maybe we'd be in a different position, and maybe some of those indicators would be moving in different directions. But Nicole, I'm going to pass this conversation. I'm going to bring you into the conversation actually on this as well, because I've got another question which is similar from Karen Ferguson, which is really about, what are we looking for from corporate Australia? And I think the investor community has been really important in this, in terms of, I think a debate that's sometimes seen as either or, commercial or sustainable, in a broader sense. And I think what the investor community has done is really brought a focus on this. So perhaps you might like to talk to, what your expectations are of business and how you're communicating that to them and what you're expecting back from them.
Absolutely, Melinda. And I think it really would be helpful to start with why we consider the SDGs important to us from an investor perspective. Now, in 2017, Cbus adopted the SDGs, and we identified 7 key SDGs that we thought we could meaningfully contribute. And there's really 7 reasons why we thought this was an important framework for us moving forward. Now, if I can touch on the concept of universal ownership, and if you look in respect of the super system in Australia, superannuation funds, we double in size every 3 to 5 years. And as an industry, we're twice the size of GDP, sitting at around 3 trillion. So we're getting larger and more diversified enough that we essentially own a slice of the market. So most of the companies and assets that we invest in. And so therefore we can't decouple ourselves from the real world economy where our members' money is invested, and particularly also where they live, work and retire. And going to Rod's point about thinking wider and longer, we are long-term investors. So the investment returns we make for our members are inherently connected to a global economy. And therefore, how we deploy that capital needs to consider these broader environmental and societal outcomes. And if you think of the size of the opportunity that we're talking about, the numbers that we've seen estimated $5 to $7 trillion are required every year until 2030 to meet the outcomes of the SDGs. Now, in terms of other things we're seeing from an investor perspective, we are seeing increasing expectations on ourselves as well by other stakeholders. So our members, we've recently surveyed them and on issues that they think are important to them. And many of them agree that these type of issues that are coming out in the SDGs, decent work, climate change, for etc., are important in helping them deliver their long-term retirement savings. And our members are very practical people. They're tradespeople in the building and construction industry. So you can expect, if they get it, that broader society shares these same expectations. We're seeing regulators in terms of modern slavery laws in Australia, and also requiring action on the risks and opportunities of climate change. The rise in sustainable finance initiatives in Australia and also Europe, who's leading, these outcomes are very much being regulated, and the pandemic itself, which we've touched on and identified the inequality. I think in terms of our expectations of business, the way we look at this from an investor perspective is really focusing on materiality. So what we want from companies is to understand and use these types of framework as ways to identify the risks and also the opportunities of how to create value, because we consider, if you take account of these issues, you're looking at a company is looking at itself really from a holistic perspective and how it can be more sustainable over the long term, because that's how we invest to get outcomes for our members' retirement, so really they can retire with dignity. Now, if we touch on what we've seen in terms of the outcomes from reporting, it's really quite interesting, because investors we're seeing are starting to use the SDGs as a framework, and some work the investor group on climate change did indicated that there was an increase of about 60% of 1.5 trillion of Australian and New Zealand investors are using the SDG frameworks from a climate change perspective, and that's doubled in a year. We've also seen that in work, the research that ACSI, the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, has done as well. It's doubled since 2017, the ASX 200 reporting against the SDGs, and we've seen this as a global trend as well. And if you go back to the point around metrics and targets, just look at what's happened on climate change throughout COVID. We've seen countries, we've seen companies and investors alike, including ourselves, start to set targets around important issues like climate change.
Thanks, Nicole. I think it's really important to bring that perspective, and I think that the importance that the investor community puts on that, I think, reinforces it to business, but also sends a really clear signal to the wider community that this isn't just window dressing, if I could put it that way. In our Pigeonhole app, people get to vote on the questions that they think are the most popular. And so I've got a little red line here that's telling me that this is the most popular question. And I'm going to flip it to you first, John, so heads up, it's an interesting question, because you've got the 17 goals and you've presented different indicators in isolation, if you like. And Stephen's question is really about, with so many of the individual goals going backwards or not tracking where we would like them to, is there a sort of root interconnected cause? Are there points of interconnection that we need to be focusing on? So the framework itself is really important, but how do we think about how the pieces knit together?
Well, I think one key connecting factor is we're doing well where we're putting a priority on it. And as a community, we're collaborating, and health and education are the classic examples of that. And I think we've shown in our COVID response that we actually do better on that than a lot of other Western countries. And frankly, why we're not doing well in climate is, as a country, we're divided, and we've got strong vested interests who have opposed action. So there's not sort of a magic bullet about this. It's a lot of it is about you achieve where you have strong goals, where you have a level of bipartisanship and collaboration. And where we're doing badly is in the areas where we don't have that level of collaboration and we have a very partisan approach.
That's pretty short and sweet. Rod, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think there's also something really powerful about thinking broadly and thinking long. So when you look wide and you think of what's possible by 2030, you simply see a wider range of opportunities and risks. So your kind of contextual intelligence of sort of the context in which you're making your decision, it's much easier to imagine some things that can be achieved by 2030 that might be really hard if you're only looking at it in terms of short-term positions today. So it allows you to sort of look at long-term interests in a broad sense to spot opportunities. So I think the SDG framework and the breadth and the length of it actually is sort of an entrepreneur's dream. I think it enables us to see things that we wouldn't see when we take a more narrow solo-based view or when we take a short-term view.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. And Sam, I'm going to drag you into this because I'm really interested in your thoughts on whether business or how business can help bring a longer term perspective. And let me give you a kind of play on a recent development coming from COVID that I think was really important for some of the businesses you're involved in with, particularly Mirvac, which is, population growth was seen as a sort of an assumed trajectory that most people would have said actually it's the most predictable trajectory we have, right? It just doesn't move very much, particularly when you've got a steady approach to immigration. But that's changed dramatically. How does a company that is a long-term, that has to think long-term, how can they engage in this SDGs conversation and try to bring others to the table in driving that long-term focus?
Yeah, thanks, Melinda. And you're right. The things we used to take absolutely for granted, like population growth and like this incredible engine of prosperity that we've seen for most years, suddenly under significant pressure. And I think the point made about investors and this incredible pressure that's coming to all companies from really strong investment perspectives, and we heard from the Cbus environment, but generally around most investors globally now, is that the expectation is that the business must step up and actually help to face some of those really significant challenges to our future. And in the Australian context, we're all the companies I'm involved with, we're feeling that very much from our investors about a solution on the risk side. So how are we managing the risk of a decline in the consumer market, and what do you have to do to rethink that? And part of that response goes to some of the other SDG goals, which we've been good at traditionally in this country around things like health and education, as Rod and John have said. But it means reorienting. And I think businesses coming back to government and to investors with responses to say, if you're seriously in the business of building back better, when you've got these big structural changes that have hit us, then we have to think very differently about where that future lies. And for Australia, if we think about decent work in the economy with less people in it, or less people supported by migration, then it takes you to things like we should care very deeply about the caring professions. We should link some of the policies and focus that take us to understanding that there's big employment opportunities in sustainably looking at what it will make to build back better. So the caring professions of care for our elderly, care for our disabled, care for our young, suddenly opens up a different conversation that I think sits really comfortably within the SDGs. One of them takes you to gender equality and women's participation in the economy. We know how hard that was hit before COVID and even more disastrously through COVID. And all of a sudden, the SDG 5 on gender equality becomes a pathway for thinking about a response to a decrease in population by increasing the involvement and engagement as a driver of productive parts of our economy. So for me, the big shocks that have come are actually responded to by a framework of 17 goals that, when taken in conjunction with the issues we're facing, do provide that framework and a much more holistic view about how we solve for these issues. And we know it's the kind of issues that really affect the days, the life and experiences of people in the country who want to see this kind of response from business, from government, and are expecting to see a different form of prosperity and a different form of longer term engagement with things that the goals really care about. So for me, the goals present the pathway to deal with some of these shocks that have come. And one of those shocks we've known has been coming for a while, which is now imputed into our financial and regulatory system, is of course climate change. And we've seen that reflected in regulators who've made it quite clear that there's now a director's duty to account for climate risk and climate action and climate response. And we had central bankers and regulators from around the world telling us that if we don't have a response on the climate crisis in the next few years, that goes to undermining so many more aspects of our future prosperity. So acting on that against the targets that have been set suddenly becomes a really clear priority. And we've got the measurements for that in the SDGs, which is why I think we're seeing other nations that are committing and businesses moving very rapidly to net zero types of targets, which again fit comfortably with the SDGs. So, I think what we've got is a great prescription to deal with those shocks. And we began to learn about that through COVID. What we can't do is lose that in this moment where we can build back better and just see governments failing to work together with business and civil society, universities and good business to take advantage of this moment.
Yeah, Nicole, I'm a little bit conscious that we're going to be approaching 2 very quickly, but 2 p.m, which is our finish time. But I did just want to give you the opportunity to just give us a little bit of a perspective. I mean, obviously you invest long term on behalf of your members because that's their liability, so to speak, or your liability on their behalf. So how, does the SDG framework provide you with the opportunity to drag other people's horizons, a bit longer term?
Yeah, look, I think it does. And in terms of how it's playing out, so what we're seeing from a company reporting perspective, because that does give insights into how we interact with companies on these matters, because what we're seeing in Australia is through engagement through some of our service providers, we do encourage Australian companies to use this framework for reporting. And we are seeing around 43% of the ASX 200 reporting against the SDGs, which is very pleasing. What we would like to see is that they set targets and they identify the levers they have to invest and understand the potential risks these pose. What I think is interesting is what we've seen globally. There was a study of over 1,000 companies, is that Australia does lag behind from a reporting perspective and acknowledging the SDGs. 79% of these companies that they surveyed globally were mentioning the SDGs. Only 45% articulated a clear strategy and only 6% used metrics. So from a superannuation perspective and an investor perspective, we've got a great opportunity to engage with companies to help them understand what we're looking at from a long-term perspective. So absolutely, I do think that the SDGs provide a good framework around this. And to give an example, if you consider the collective actions and engagement that investors do around climate change on the Climate Action 100, what we're seeing is that encouragement, and I would say it's getting to the point of the necessity for companies to set long-term targets on these types of issues. And we've seen that as an example of companies setting net zero emissions by 2050. And then also that requiring them to set interim targets, because I think whilst we can direct companies what we're looking at over the long term, we also need to understand the strategy and the pathway for how they're going to get there. So it's a bit of a two-pronged approach to make sure that pushing forward for the future, but also making sure the strategy is aligning to get there as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. So the fun of our session today is actually going to be another video question from Catherine Brown from the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. Hopefully.
I'm Catherine Brown, the CEO of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. My question relates to the areas of the SDG Transforming Australia report where we're doing well against the SDGs, such as education and health, and how those strengths could help us move more quickly on our climate and our economic inclusion goals.
So, John, you sort of anticipated this question earlier, I think, in one of your responses, where you highlighted exactly health and education as areas where we're doing better than some of the other areas. And you talked about those being areas where we're actually focused on it. Perhaps what we might do is just get you, given your former life, to reflect on perhaps how we might get better collaboration across levels of government to pay attention to the areas where we're not making as much progress as we might.
Well, I think we've seen a good example with the COVID response, and that's around having, one, clear objectives, and two, agreeing to collaborate across government. And that's been one of the reasons we've been successful. And a second way to do that, I think, is to have some agreed national goals. They don't have to tie down everything, but let's get behind goals across parties and work towards them. And then the third issue that I think is important that hasn't come up, but I think is critical to this, is involving local communities and what you can learn from health in that. And one of the really incredibly positive things around the COVID response has been the way that the Aboriginal controlled health organisations have done such an outstanding job in reducing the risk for the Indigenous community. And a lot of that is about local control. So I'd add that to the points that need to be done. And I know that's something that Catherine Brown at the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation has strongly supported, that local community action. And I should say thank you also to the Foundation for supporting our work.
I think it's a really important point that you raised there, John, and one you're right, we haven't really touched on. And you can have this overarching framework. You've presented the progress against the goals in the context of our sort of national performance, if you like. But, ultimately achieving better aggregate and national outcomes doesn't mean that it has to be owned just at one level, or that all of the solutions are held at one level. And in fact, anyone who's listened to me on this topic knows I'm quite passionate about the fact that the more you empower local communities, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, not surprisingly, the better results you get. So I think there's a real challenge for us in terms of how we connect this, multinational organisation framework and down right to the grassroots to get people engaging with it and realising how important it is to the sorts of progress that we want to see as a nation. Rod, did you have anything else to add? I know you've worked across different levels of government. Is there anything you wanted to bring in terms of how we might get people lined up for better progress?
Yeah, I think that John's point about articulating the end game is really powerful. So being clear about sort of the future we want, the outcomes we want to achieve. And then I think this actually an interesting moment for Australia broadly in terms of our model for the dynamism in our economic model has been so wedded to being an open economy and wedded to trade and foreign direct investment and migration. And some of those taps are turning off or slowing down. And I think it's a really interesting opportunity to think about how do we really go hard about a homegrown growth model? How do we really go hard about investing in skills and innovation and really driving a people-powered economy, not driven by migration, but driven by a really deep commitment to education and skills and the participation and contribution of everyone in our community. And I think there's a really powerful inclusive growth model that I actually think is a really consistent story with Australia's policy traditions. We created a living wage, a wage earners welfare state. We managed to do post-war nation building, mass migration, open our economy into the world. We can do this. Our institutions and our people are strong enough to do this, but it's going to take a bit of leadership to articulate that frame and kind of articulate what the next model might be.
Well, thanks, Rod. That's a pretty good point to end up on, I think. Now, before I thank each of our presenters, I've been dangling this poll question before you all day. So the question we asked people was, in what areas do you want to see the most progress over the next 5 years? Let's call it 55% said climate action. About 9% said reducing poverty and inequality. 27% said in the area of innovation and industry transformation. And about 9% said decent work and economic growth. So I think really interesting. I mean, I guess not surprised. Oh, hang on, they're getting updated. Climate action is scooted even further to the top with about 70%. So perhaps not surprising, I suspect. It's been a great conversation. Let me thank Nicole, Sam, John, and Rod. To the audience, I know you've got a bunch of other questions that you've asked, some of them quite specific. Keep putting your questions in, and I'll make sure that I email them to Rod and he can give me all of the answers I need. He's smiling as I say that. So we'll make sure that we do get as many answers to those questions as we can. I did want to put a little bit of a plug in, and hopefully Nicole is going to think this is an interesting development as well. I wanted to announce that next year, one of the things that CEDA is going to be launching is the CEDA Sustainable Development Goals Network. And the aim of that network is actually going to bring members together to share ideas and information about how they're using the SDGs, the progress they're making, and how we can promulgate best practice and drive progress, basically, but to be led by members. We'll be looking, we've got some opportunities for foundation partners to be involved. We're in some conversations with people already. When we've got that bedded down, we'll announce further information. But I just think it was very consistent with some of the messages and themes that came across from our speakers today. And we're looking to play our role in trying to bring people together who share that aspiration as well, to see what further progress we can enable in support of long-term social and economic development. Just finally, even though it feels like a long year and it is November, we still have some amazing events coming up on the CEDA calendar. We've got an event on reimagining workplace mental health. We will be hearing from the Victorian Treasurer, Tim Pallas, who's going to talk about the Victorian budget. And something near and dear to my heart, because I've been driving the agenda, so I can be a bit selfish. At the end of November, we're launching CEDA's inaugural Public Interest Technology Forum, which is really looking to explore how we can put public interest at the heart of the development, adoption and use of technology and build community confidence in the use of technology. So still a lot of meat on the bones for us this year. And Rod, you mentioned the word dynamism. We're also doing some work on economic dynamism, picking up some of the themes that you spoke to. So you can expect to see more of that as well. All of this information, of course, is available at ceda.com.au. Thank you so much for being involved today. Thank you again to Monash University for their support. We can't do these types of events without your support, so it's been fantastic to have you involved in today's conversation. I look forward to seeing you all again at some point in the future. Thank you again, Nicole, Rod, Sam and John, and good afternoon, everyone.